Susan and Christina organized this panel of people to reflect on the history and future of our organization. We're going to run it like a sort of informal conversation, which will be very easy with all of these intelligent, articulate people. My function is just to nod thoughtfully and ask questions at appropriate moments. So I will introduce our panelists, and just in case you don't know them all. In the left corner, Owen Chapman, who is an associate professor of communication studies at Concordia University and also currently serving on the executive board. To his right, Lynn Grenier, the renowned and wonderful and lovely professeur agrégé in the Département de Communication at Université de Montréal and long-standing member of IASPM Canada. Charity Marsh, my predecessor as president, she has the longest job title, give me a minute. She's a Canada Research Chair in Interactive Media and Popular Music, and also an associate professor at the University of Regina. And to my left, Paul Aitken, who as of July 1st will be an assistant professor of critical technical studies and communication studies at York University. So thank all four of you for being here. What we thought we'd do is I'm going to start by asking all of you to reflect on how being involved in IASPM Canada has worked in your individual careers and what that experience has been like for you as professionals. So maybe we'll start with Owen, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I did, in thinking about this remark in particular, I had to do a bit of personal archival research. And thanks to Google, I was able to trace out the title and abstract for the first paper that I gave at IASPM Canada, which was back in 2002. I didn't have it on my hard drive anymore, and I was like, No, I Googled it, and it was all good. In 2002, I would have just started my PhD at Concordia in communication studies. And for me, that PhD was, obviously an important moment considering where I am now, but it was also at that moment quite pivotal. I had been studying history and philosophy of science throughout my undergrad and my master's degree, and I'd actually started a PhD at Notre Dame University, in history and philosophy of science, and after about 3 months, I was thinking to myself, what am I doing here? This is not the right place for me. This is not the right type of scholarship that I want to engage with. And principally, it was because I was having a hard time explaining what I was doing to the people who I was closest to, so my family and my friends and whatever. We were talking about particle mechanics and quantum physics and these kind of crazy questions, and it was very difficult for me to relate why this was important and why it was interesting. So I took some time off from graduate study, and when I came to Concordia, it was to pursue a degree that was focused on what had become a more recent passion at the time, which was sampling and DJ practice, DJ culture. And so I very happily found a home for that scholarship at Concordia. I had to search a little bit to see where I would be able to do that. And so this initial IASPM conference in 2002 was the Sound in the City conference in Montreal. It was a spectacular event from what I recall, and for me it was kind of entry into the, I guess, sort of the scholarly professionalization of what up until then had just been a habit, a hobby, something that I was deeply passionate about, but I was just starting to bring it into my scholarly work. So the title of that paper, which I had to dig up, was Sound Recording and Aura, Mechanical Reproduction in the Work of Art of the Age. I'd recently become kind of enamored with Walter Benjamin, and like many of us do, we take the title of that paper and we kind of mix it up into our own work. The thing that I remember most about delivering that paper was that I had thought and assumed, I think rightly, that this IASPM conference would be a place that I could really make good on my promise to myself to make sure the scholarship that I was doing was tied to my practice as an emergent musician and DJ. And I didn't have a car back in the day, but I did want to bring some of my equipment to showcase in the moment of that presentation. So I took my Technics 1200 turntable and I packed it up in its flight case. And for those of you who know that turntable, it probably weighs about 50 pounds, especially with all the other stuff that I was carrying. And I got onto the metro and metroed down and walked up the hill to McGill. And by the time I got there, my arm felt really like it was about to fall out of my socket. So I was already starting things off, somewhat fragile state. And the conference panel, we were second in the morning. The title of the panel was, I say we because, I'll have to explain that in a minute. It was Electric Avenue was the title of the panel, which I also thought was kind of cheeky and fun. So I was like, all right, here I am. I'm in the right place. And there were two other young scholars, emerging scholars on the panel, Tobias Van Veen and also Charity Marsh. And that was the first time that we met. And Paul Theberge was moderating the panel. Charity, I don't know if you're going to talk about your paper. Okay, so I'll talk about it. The title was Beyond the Visceral via the Raving Cyborg, Locating Dance Spaces Between the Semiotic and the Symbolic. Thank you, Google. And Tobias's paper was also on turntablism, turntables, warehouses, techno and revolution, the sounds of the temporary autonomous zone. So without going too much more into detail about it, I was exceedingly, impressed is not a strong enough word. I was impacted by the presentation that Charity made on that day. And really, she was talking about Bjork, as I recall, which was an artist that was really important to me as well. So I really started to feel like not only had I chosen the right place to present my own work, but I presented the right kind of place to meet other people who were like-minded and who were working on stuff that I wasn't seeing represented elsewhere. And so the panel went quite well. The one thing that was kind of strange about it, though, was that Tobias got extremely excited when he realized there was a Technics 1200 turntable present, and he got all busy on it. Before my presentation, I think Paul decided to invert the order of speakers. I can't remember what happened, but anyway, I remember sort of standing back horrified as he was like scratching and hammering away, and he was obviously nervous, and so his hand was shaking and the needle was bouncing all over the place. And Charity also, I could tell that we were going to be friends because she was cringing along with me. So from that moment on, I started to realize that IASPM was a special kind of place, and an environment in which that type of scholarship was not only taken seriously, but you could have a good time also presenting it. And so 2 years later, I went to the IASPM conference at Carleton, which I also dug up. I was talking with Will because I think Will was one of the main organizers, if not the main organizer of that conference that year in 2004. And what was that again? Yes, I don't remember the title of the conference, but I gave another paper around sample-based music. It was called Sonic Sedition Through Oral Audition, Who's Got the Conch in Sample-Based Music? And at that point, I was struggling trying to think about sampling as a type of practice where the music that one engages with as a sample-based artist is almost an equivalent participant in the direction of the composition that one makes, which was, for me, an important articulation that ended up becoming foundational to my PhD thesis, was kind of recognizing that when one engages with, in the case of sampling and hip-hop culture, which I was and am still quite fascinated with, when one engages with that level of popular music, it's not a matter of utmost control. Really, the music informs and also guides the type of musical compositional practice as much as one's own ideas, right? And again, in IASPM, I found a really receptive audience and an audience that could really feed back new ideas and new ways to push that research. So I'll stop there because I'm sure others have lots of things to say, but obviously those 2 moments early in the stage of my PhD were really, really important in terms of making me feel like this was something that other people were going to want to pay attention to.
Great, thank you, Owen.
Thank you.
Should we just go down the line and ask Lynn to speak next? I'll invert the order next time, keep you guys on your toes, but yeah.
Okay. In career, right?
Career. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Listening to Owen, I cannot but go back, and I go back a bit further down the road. And one thing I want to say, though, before going into personal career, is that IASPM throughout the last 30 years has changed a whole lot. So at different points in different time, I think it will have meant something different for different individuals, not only because of the individual's path of people would have followed throughout whatever they're doing, but also because the organization itself was providing different types of forum at different types and different moments in time. So that, I guess, we'll come back to. But in a very similar way to lots of people, I think. I came to IASPM, which was just not existing, but we existed because we decided to make it exist. But just about at the same time, very early on in my PhD. And the difference was there was no significant community that was already there. There were individuals whose work we read about. But for the first time, 30 years ago, we decided there was enough of these groups of individuals that maybe we could create a forum where we could hang in there together and challenge each other and so on. So early on in my PhD, I met a group of people whose work had been reading internationally, and you know these people as the ancestors. So I'm not going to say fathers of IASPM, that's impossible in my mind, but they're mostly men. So Simon Frith, Philip Tagg, all these people who have come to play a role, each in their own ways. There was a conference organized where these people were presenting. They were younger, we were all quite younger, and they made a big impression, not only in terms of providing, seeing people whose work you've read and you found, wow, this is really the type of thing I'm looking forward to doing, or at least to engaging with, but also because of the ways in which they were sharing this work, and not only sharing and debating and engaging with each other, but also, and that for me that's always been very important, having a strong and very significant political engagement with whatever they were doing. By that I don't necessarily mean raise a flag and do blah blah blah, but something that linked their intellectual pursuits to their own ways of being in the world, as, name it, musicians, some were journalists, some were academics, some were, so that for me, that was really striking. So for a young PhD scholar, like really starting, and with no one like around like we have now, it meant a whole lot of things. So I think throughout the years, what for me has stayed there is not only because we became a group that, with changing members over the years, but a group where you could, as Owen was saying, you could present your work, get amazing feedback from people from all over and looking at different perspectives, but also people who seem to, for whom what they do matter. Not just as a conference, you go, you attend, and of course it's one line in your CV and you move on, but it's a place that, for me at least, matters. Matters for all sorts of reasons. And I think that throughout the years, that's something that's stayed. So it's a place that matters.
So, great. Charity, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here this morning. Well, let me just talk a little bit about IASPM career-based. I came to IASPM in 1999. The only conference I had been to before was an AMS conference in Baltimore, where people were very, very violent with one another. It was a mean-spirited kind of place, and yet everybody talked about how it wasn't. So it was kind of interesting as an undergraduate but yet at the same time, that was the first place, a professor had taken me there with him. I was introduced to popular music scholarship. I mean, at that point, I was still a medieval scholar. What am I thinking? But it was a really important moment. I saw Bob Fink give a paper on Nine Inch Nails, actually, I think, at that conference, and it kind of made me go, I can talk about this stuff. And it was in '99, I headed down to Brock, and Scott, this was one of the conferences you hosted, and I remember being so nervous that people were going to be mean, and it wasn't that kind of experience at all. I was on a panel. On that panel, I think there were 3 juniors. We were in our MA scholars and trying to present these ideas. And one was a paper on Madonna by Melissa West, who I ended up co-writing a lot with. Another, and my paper was on Bjork. I can't remember the third, but it was a really important place because it was a place where we ended up getting a lot of very good productive feedback and a lot of support for that work, which was really important at that time for me as a junior scholar, and it changed the way I thought about conferences and scholarly organizations and what they actually could be and what they meant to, especially to junior scholars. And it's really exciting to see how IASPM has grown and how much more of a mass we have now across Canada with young people working, or not necessarily, we're all young and old, but juniors, and now we have a real body of, maybe we could say seniors, scholars, that are actually doing the work from various different disciplinary perspectives on popular music. And so it's really nice that we actually have grown in a way where our conferences, I mean, just in the last 5 years even, to see the number of proposals that we receive to give papers at the conferences, the number of people that come out. It's really a very exciting time, I think, for popular music in Canada. So there was that. The other thing I think that is really important, or has been really important in my career, is that IASPM Canada has been a place where I have been able to talk about very uncomfortable things. Things that, exist for us in the real world and in real life. But I mean, I remember Melissa and I writing a paper on academic fandom that was presented at a conference in Western, or the conference just before that, and then the theme was taken up at the following year. And it was on the struggle we were having as young women, studying women artists, and constantly being told that we were fans, and talked to in these kinds of ways by some of our peers, but also by some of the senior members. And so IASPM became a place to challenge the canon of what was being studied too, and to provoke and to push at some of these things that to be a serious scholar, I didn't necessarily have to study, the White Rock Boys. And so, but it was a place for us to have those conversations, which are often not very pleasant conversations to have. And so for me, this has been a place where, another place too, where we get to actually embrace practitioners and creators as well, and trying to, I think we always could do more about that, and in that way, it's something that we've been struggling with and working on as an organization, but that's also too something that I think we've really started to see change and shift. And I think that's very meaningful for me as someone who both practices and does scholarship and tries to constantly bring these two things together in a way that makes sense in the academic world, especially within our institutions and on performance reviews and those weird things that we are bound by often. But yes, IASPM, the other thing, I was saying this last night, in a group, just saying, since I started coming, I think I've only missed, so 99, I've only missed one conference, and it was because I was at another conference, and I should have been at IASPM, totally. But I've come every year, and I look forward to coming every year because it's also a place where, people that I care about and whose work I care about and whose work has truly affected me and how I think about music and how I engage, these are the people I get to see every year, and I know you say that, oh, this is so great, it's about networking. Yes, but I think my mentors have been in this organization. And I think that for me, as a person in a career and all of the things that I have wanted to do and done, I have done in ways that very much I've taken cues and guides and advice and tried to emulate the people that are here. So I'll just leave it there, but I think those have all had incredible impacts on how I have decided to go about and choose the path that I've gone on, and how I've chosen to work with graduate students as well. These are people who've mentored me on how to mentor.
Thank you, Charity. Paul?
Hi, I'd like to just echo some of those thoughts as well. It was an incredible privilege to be asked to be a part of this panel in which, my mentors actually sit. So it was very cool to get asked to do this. Before I think about what it means for my career, I'd just like to offer that IASPM Canada is probably really great for my record collection more than anything because, already having chaired one panel yesterday, I've got a list of music to listen to, Chilean music and Danish indie rock, and so I have all sorts of things now that have just increased my record collection probably tenfold since I started coming to these things. So, maybe we could fold that into a career discussion, but just from, the pure pleasure standpoint of being exposed to all of this kind of really cool music, I think it's probably one of the reasons I like to keep showing up. Interestingly, my history with IASPM, intensified probably starting around 2007, but I had found out about the organization in 2000, 2001, when it started to become okay to talk about popular music at a university. You see, I started in my undergrad sort of flipping between York University and Western. And if anybody remembers Western in the early part of the 1990s, I ran in fear if I said the word the Beatles in the hallway. I had to sort of scurry, and somebody was going to come along with a cat of nine tails or some other kind of medieval weapon and discipline me. So I heard about the organization as an undergraduate, and then I was really introduced to it when I started working with Jacqueline Warwick and Steve Bauer at Dalhousie, and was encouraged to start thinking about attending these things. And it's kind of funny that my first experience actually at an IASPM Canada took place in the United States at the Boston Joint Conference in 2007, where I gave a co-written paper with Christina Bada. And we had a whale of a time, I think, doing that. First of all, we got a great response because every time we quoted somebody, we would each trade off the quoting. So she would speak as one character, and I would speak with another. And apparently nobody had thought to do this before, so we got a great response out of that. And then, my sort of dual interest in popular music and technology were also kind of exposed during that paper as well. We had written a paper sort of comparing different sort of nostalgic interpretations of Glenn Miller's In the Mood, and I had spliced them all together and played them through section by section, right? So it was the whole piece, but each 8 or 12 bar section was from a different recording by different artists and things like that. And I started to realize, that at this point you can start to really kind of fuse a lot of the different things that you're interested in, especially working with a group, and somebody's already mentioned just how interdisciplinary the type of scholarship that we do. I'm in a communications department, you're in a communications department, music departments, sort of. Okay, a lot of us find ourselves in different homes, and I guess my point being that the types of scholarship that goes on here and the types of scholarship that I found that I was able to actually do could cross all of these kind of boundaries. I didn't just have to necessarily talk about the way that it sounded, or we could start to to put a few of these different things together. So as a scholar, quite aside from my career, I suppose, the networking, and it's nice to sort of, build contacts and things like that. But quite aside from the career, just, as a scholar, as a thinker of popular music and popular culture, it's been a great place just to be exposed to so many different ways of thinking about popular music. And as a practitioner as well, that's been really important in the way that I think about playing music and performing music. So there's all of these nice crossovers that I think I've been able to kind of get out of the organization. And that's, kind of where I'm at so far.
Great, thanks all. I think we've heard all of you talking about sort of the interdisciplinarity of this organization being such a crucial thing, and I absolutely agree with that. In a way, because it's interdisciplinary, it's also oddly more focused in a lot of ways. I've always found my home discipline is musicology, and my colleagues at Dalhousie are wonderful people, collegial, supportive, interesting, but my colleagues are, a medievalist and an 18th century opera specialist and a 19th century orchestral music specialist, and they don't really know the music that I care about, and certainly I'm not expanding my record collection through those people the way I do when I come here, and it's when I see all of you people that it's, there's like a shorthand that there's a lot of things I can just drop, right? I don't have to explain, turntablism means, I can actually talk in different ways. And it's because all of you come from such different disciplines, I think, that, but we all have this shared passion for this kind of music. And probably all of us, I suspect, hearing these reflections, and it certainly resonates with me, have had maybe a little bit of a chip on our shoulder about that, popular music is worthy of study, damn it. And it's okay to talk about this in serious scholarly ways. And that perhaps that dynamic or that energy has been part of what's made this organization such a lively, exciting place to come, I would suggest. So what I want to move now to is I'm going to ask Paul and Charity both sort of said they would talk a little bit about the ways that IASPM Canada, maybe expand a little bit on how IASPM Canada's culture is distinct from other scholarly organizations. You already told us your scary AMS story, which, I have lots of those too. but would love to hear you both talk further on that. So I don't know, do you guys want to? We'll start with Charity, because, yeah.
I think, yes, one of the things that makes IASPM Canada distinct, and I think many of you know this, and it's part of the reason you come each year, is that it's a supportive environment in which even for those, even that very how can I say this? Even works, we constantly talk about the papers we give as works in progress, or we talk about these papers as, here's 12 pages of this book chapter, or et cetera. And so, of course, we know that coming to a conference, it's 20 minutes. You know, it's basically, I don't know who can read 12 pages, but I can read 8 to 10 pages, maybe double-spaced, with an example. So of course, it's the kernels often we come with, right? Those kernels, things that we're working on, that we're really excited about, or that we have no idea how to work through. And I think here is a space where we start to do that work and where we get this kind of really interesting feedback. And not so much as I have seen in some other organizations where there's a bit more posturing and a bit more defensiveness, I suppose, around, or ownership maybe is part of it, is what I often see. And maybe it's partially because our organization is a bit smaller in the sense of intimacy. I think it's also some of the things, I think it's also too because of some of the things that IASPM Canada has come to stand for, and are some of the changes too, where it's grown from, you know, a much smaller group where we just didn't have a lot of people working on popular music in Canadian institutions. And so yes, this concern that we are constantly, and still for many of us, are constantly defending what it is we do. I am, in Saskatchewan, I'm the only person working on music. That's an entire province, you know, like, you know, and my colleagues, my closest colleagues, you know, Richard in Calgary, Nicholas in Winnipeg, you know, like, this is far. There's not a lot of actual support in that geography. And so here, I think, we continue to support each other in those really important ways, which I think is certainly different. It's certainly different in IASPM US. It's a much larger contingent, more things going on, even in other kinds of organizations. But the other thing I've sort of lost my train, but I've thought. But the other thing that coming back to it is this sense that IASPM Canada has, as we've grown, we've seen things and commitments to some larger issues. So our commitment to moving the conference east, middle, west, etc. These are very important things that we've, you know, come together, thought about, realized are important because people need support in their actually physically at institutions with a community of scholars to demonstrate that yes, this is you know, to demonstrate the level of academic rigor that we bring to this discipline. And so even one of that shift that we've been working with, and some of those goals that IASPM Canada has taken on, those initiatives, I think are very, very important and make us different. I know lots of people, okay, north, east, west, there's lots of things that happen there on, but I think our dedication to that has allowed our organization, allowed IASPM Canada to evolve and grow in a different kind of way, and has done a lot to support the faculty across the country. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay, so it might seem odd why I chose to respond to this question when I say that, you know, I don't really have a lot to compare it to. Certainly my experience with other music organizations is very small. I think I was at a SAM conference once, which seemed quite nice. It was large, much larger than this, and kind of a bit unwieldy. And certainly I'd echo that, you know, I think the size of the institute, the organization is really nice because you do start to get to know everybody by face, if not by name, you know, and each year, you know, we can sort of, you know, recognize each other in the hallways and things like that. But the reason that I wanted to kind of respond to this was actually just to kind of make an interesting, or raise a point that I think is kind of interesting. And it's already kind of happened. Each one of us down the line has kind of expressed this definition of what we do, our type of scholarship, in sort of negative terms, not like the value judgment, but, you know, what we do is not that. It's not the canon. It's not the established, you know, musicological or ethnomusicological discipline, right? And I wonder, and I'm not, you know, making a call on this at the moment, but I wonder if we might be able to move to a point, or it might be worth entertaining thinking about not thinking in terms of negative definitions of what we do. So I didn't necessarily want to compare it to other organizations in the sense of saying, okay, we do this differently than, say, AMS does that or SAM does that, although those are obviously valuable discussions to have. but to maybe reflect more on the possibilities of offering, I guess, positive definitions of what it is that we do. And Owen mentioned, at the beginning of the discussion that there was a difficulty in explaining what you do to your peers, right, to your friends and family. I've started personally to take the tack of not trying to sort of first circumscribe my research by identifying all those things that it's not, but instead offering just sort of point blank, like, this is what it's about, and this is precisely why it's important, or its importance is implicit in the study of it. And anyways, I'm just kind of raising this point because I think one of the maybe and when we find out more about how the organization was founded, if Lean talks about that, we might think about the ways in which we've started to define the study of popular music and the ways in which that's changed. It strikes me, and I could be wrong in this, but it's my impression, certainly given talking to some senior scholars and in my own experience, that the whole idea began as a way of saying, okay, we're not that. Right? We've moved away, and we're doing something that is sort of defined negatively by that. Maybe we've moved to a point where we can start to define this positively and start flipping the terms around. And I guess that's kind of why I wanted to respond to this. So I can't really say it's different than the CCA or the other organizations that I've been to. Largely because if there is a difference, it's because I like to spend all 4 days at IASPM conferences, whereas in the other ones I just got to drop in, give my paper, and leave, because it's much more fun to hang out with all of you guys than it is usually to hang out with the people at those other organizations. So, anyways, that was my point.
So what you're saying is we're cooler.
Yeah, well, I thought that was implicit too. It's 8:30 in the morning.
Never a bad idea to get that out in the open. Yeah. No, I think this point about I said chip on our shoulders earlier, and of course that sounds sort of negative and depressing, but actually in a lot of ways I think that's a real gift that we have, that people who do scholarship in this field, that we are constantly having to think about what it is that we do and why it's important and why it's valuable. I think if you're a Beethoven scholar, for example, it's very easy to become sort of complacent and a bit myopic, like, well, I study Beethoven, and obviously that's important, and people when we have the opportunity, in fact we have the task, the obligation to constantly ask ourselves, why are we doing this, why is this important, why have I chosen this project, what is its value, and I think that's gives us a kind of energy and shared vigor that gets replenished when we meet together like this. So those are my thoughts. I wasn't really supposed to talk, but everybody knew that wasn't going to happen then. But let's move now, please, Lynn, to talk a little bit about how and why IASPM was founded, and bear witness to that historic event. Important, momentous event.
Sure. I asked Jenny not to start with that. So we wouldn't start with, okay, in the good old days. So, and I said to her, I'm more inclined to think in terms of a Foucauldian perspective on the history of the present rather than a sort of purely nostalgia-driven things were like this. But for the sake of answering a question, I think there's maybe 3 important things to mention. One is that in 1983, when we officially, and I say we because there was a small group of us, very small group of us, less than this, we decided that we were thrilled to know that an international association, because it started internationally, and I think that's worth mentioning. So we were excited that we could participate in that international association that was driven by sheer passion, sheer interest in talking about popular music, doing things with popular music, and doing that internationally. Ce qui fait que, d'entrée de jeu, cet aspect-là a semblé absolument essentiel pour nous qui avions cette idée banale de dire on est peut-être tout petit, mais on va participer à cet événement beaucoup plus large. If I switch back at this point, it's not a coincidence. We were a group of mostly English speakers, but a small proportion of us, quite convinced, French speakers. And the fact that the organization was defined by people who claimed that we could do that in different languages too. that we could do that in Spanish, in Swedish, in Italian, in Dutch, which were some of the languages of the people who founded that organization, was really appealing. 30 years ago, that was even more appealing. We're not yet talking about global and globalization, and that was not the words we used, but it was really, really appealing, but because we could connect with some of the issues and the importance of location as a key thing. So all this to say that when we decided to, that we could have a branch of IASPM, it was mainly to connect with that international group. And because the organization was founded on this idea that you had local branches or regional branches, that was the way to do that. So that's number one. The second thing was in the small group that we were, they were mainly people from musicology, and those were the few seniors that were there. And I think they may be worth mentioning, John Shepherd, and Rob Bauman were amongst the main people who were there, who were in their own field already starting to work on popular music, and there were not so many at that time. But there was a small bunch of way more junior people who didn't, their connection was not necessarily music, but that split, and it was really a split at the time, was worth finding a place where you could debate that, but debate it, not just pretend that you were not debating. We debated, so it became really an issue, and 30 years ago, music versus non-music, study of popular music was a key issue. So the organization was founded on the basis of, okay, let's not ignore this dual way which was transformed into multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, name it as you want, but it was really based on that. And it was not just an issue in terms of like an intellectual issue. It was, where could you do popular music studies? So it was not only institutional location, was not only discipline, it was also like really embodied in people. Who are you, and what do you do, and how do you take on popular music studies? That's the second point. The third and last one was that the branch, we were a bit young and naive, yes, but we decided that the way to launch the branch beyond, we were sure that it were more than just the 7 or 8 of us. We were sure. We're absolutely positive. It's a time, remember, no internet. So we communicated through letters. So we wrote to each other, stuff like that. It sounds a bit weird, but yeah, maybe a phone call or another. But phone calls were pigeons. But that was important. We had a sense that we were probably not the only ones, right? We didn't think that we were the only ones doing it, but we didn't know how to find whoever else was doing that, who probably felt kind of isolated in their own little ways. So we had this idea that maybe we could host an international conference. So if we could decide to say, okay, this is a very small group of us, but let's say we're going to propose to host the international conference, people will hear about it because we'll make more publicity, we'll make more, and that's exactly what we did. So there was 7 of us, and we went to and proposed to the international to say, we're going to host. We had no institutional support. We decided we will find institutional support, and we did. We found through Gaston Rochon, who at the time decided to get involved, and he had just started at UQAM, and so we managed to find institutional support, but it was not important at the time the same way, it's just to find a way. And we did host 1985, and I think that enabled the organization to send signals throughout Canada, and we did get more scholars involved, more PhD and MA students who really, from that point on, many people got involved. So I think it was more of a launch thing than anything else, and with that in mind, the organization of a national branch became more of a reality after having hosted the international conference. I think that should do for now.
That's great. The ambition of that is inspiring. Actually, that's wonderful.
Don't know what you're clapping. But.
All right. Now, Owen, you've been awfully quiet down there. I wonder if you would like to comment a little bit about how the fields of popular music studies have changed since 1983, and particularly with regard to communication and other technologies. And maybe Paul could chime in on this issue also. I knew you would say something like that. I knew you would say that.
I think what my kids are listening to now versus myself, it's certainly changed. Holy cow. Yeah, I can do my best, but I'll certainly ask my colleagues to kind of chime in. I did want to add one thing about when I was thinking about what is different about IASPM Canada, and I'm sort of running in the opposite direction from what Paul was saying in terms of there being, you don't want to start with a negative definition, but one thing I think is really important to reiterate. The other conference that I often go to is the Canadian Communications Association Conference, so the CCA. And I've been struck over the years, I mean, it's my community as well, so I always have to go and see people and enjoy myself, but the integration of students in that conference is something that I'm quite critical about. I think PhD students are very welcome, but MA students have traditionally either been asked not to submit, or when they are allowed to submit, they're kind of ghettoized into these singular panels, right? Which are supposed to be about mentorship, and they are. But it means, and there are colleagues I've heard say rather disparaging things about, oh, there's going to be MA students there, I'm not going to go, blah, blah, blah. And it's hyper frustrating, right? And so I'm so proud and happy to say that IASPM Canada has, to my knowledge, never had that attitude. And I think it's a really rich environment for exchange and for learning for everybody at all levels of careers and study and everything else. So I did want to highlight that certainly MA and PhD students are very, very more than
And even undergraduates, we've had undergraduates.
Right, yeah. Now, in terms of the fields, I thought that I could talk a little bit about, well, again, it kind of comes back to, I suppose, me, in terms of the way I think about these things. When I started with coming to IASPM Canada conferences, I had a little bit of sort of formal musical training in high school, but I kind of left that aside. And then when I continued to explore music in my own hobbyist kind of way, but it wasn't until I found electronic music, not only as a source of listening pleasure, but also as a source of kind of production and creative experimentation, that I really started to think about myself as a musician, as someone who could contribute to conversations about music, etc. But for me, it was a very technologically kind of mediated entry into the field. And then when I came to IASPM Canada, I certainly found others like Charity who were on the same kind of trajectory. But then I was exposed to a much broader sense of studying music at the scholarly level than I had been prior. So I guess the kind of musicological focus, or like an ability to not only listen to music and talk about what it means historically, what it means in terms of like popular culture, what it means in terms of different kind of methods and technologies, but also like how it's actually been put together, and the analysis of musical forms and harmonies and all of that kind of stuff was really new to me in a sense, and really, again, was an important feedback loop in terms of my thinking around how to get into the analysis of the music that I had at the heart of my research. And so I think that, again, that like coming in thinking I was going to be able to talk about popular music and electronic stuff and technology, etc., very, very open-armed, welcoming reception, but then also the sort of integration of other perspectives made me realize how interdisciplinary, as we've said already, IASPM Canada is. And then now I fast forward to 2011 when we were organizing the conference in Montreal. And as certain conversations in the hallways have pointed out, the sort of shirk funding mechanism that we've been using to support the conferences has more and more moved towards less support for kind of annual meetings, and these thematic conferences being an important way to to set things up. So as a committee, we sat down and we thought about, well, what could be the theme that would still appeal to what IASPM Canada has done in the past, would think forward into the future, and would also allow us to articulate a very strong conference theme that will hopefully get us funding. And I'm happy to say, obviously, that we got the funding. And so when we chose music and the environment, there was a lot of things happening there at the same time, and it really had to do with, again, opening up, bringing in new conversations into IASPM, and in particular, we were targeting, with music and the environment, we were targeting soundscape studies to a degree. We were also targeting mobility studies, which has become something that has been important in my career and in the career of many at Concordia and at Montreal. So we wanted to allow people to kind of come in. And I think, those fields, I mean, popular music studies, we could talk forever about how that's changing, but in terms of those fields, soundscape studies and mobility studies, soundscape studies has traditionally been really wed to the World Soundscape Project and the efforts of Murray Schafer, in the 70s, and those who he mentored, like Barry Truax and Hildegard Westerkamp, et cetera. I have a lot of respect for that work, but there was a feeling that soundscape studies, if it's going to persist, needed to start having conversations with popular music studies, for instance, and with the techniques that, at least for me, we're coming out of popular music studies in relation to field recording, integration of new technologies, mobile technologies into the collection of sounds that were then used compositionally. And soundscape studies has traditionally worked in kind of an electroacoustic sort of genre, where the hi-fi studio is the place where the action happens and where compositions which are more kind of high art oriented come out. And so by engaging soundscape studies with popular music studies, we wanted to make sure that there was a recognition that soundscape studies, if it's going to remain relevant, needs to learn from popular music studies in terms of taking seriously these other forms of music, whether beat-driven or or what have you, in terms of like popular musical forms. And I think we were very successful in terms of making that statement and bringing other people who are important to the field of soundscape studies into conversation with popular music scholars. And likewise with mobility studies, it's a very trendy kind of emergent field, and there's a lot of different ways that people come into it, but in particular the mobile device, whether the cell phone or the iPod or the MP3 player or various other handheld devices, have had a really strong impact on the world, obviously, and in particular the way we consume and use music, but also the way we use these devices now as recorders for kind of ubiquitous recording of whether it's images, sounds, or pictures. And so mobility studies is really happening right now, and by bringing it in conversation with popular music studies, I think that we demonstrate, again, the ways that popular music studies is really fluid and really is keeping up with the times. So I'm happy to say that there are lots of different papers, presentations that have been happening since 2011 at these conferences that identify and recognize these new technologies and their capacities and how they're changing, again, how we consume it and produce music, right? I did want to point out the, I'll just take one more moment to kind of point out some of these intersections, and as some of you know, like in February, we released a special edition of Why, the Journal of Mobile Media, which was the outcome. It was a curated edition, all the papers of which were drawn from the 2011 conference in Montreal. And so when I was writing the editorial for that paper, I called it Sound Moves, Intersections of Popular Music Studies, Mobility Studies, and Soundscape Studies. And people were like, how are you going to make that happen? How are you going to write that up? And it was actually a very, very easy thing to do because there's so many of the themes come together. And I think this demonstrates kind of where IASPM Canada is at now in terms of the fields being able to talk to each other so successfully. And I think what is at the heart of that success is a recognition that sound is movement in a sense, right? And you can really broaden that metaphor, though, to mean it's vibrations in space, but it's also vibrations in time, just affective kind of relations of people and places and ideas and sounds and the way they make us feel, that have these ways of looping through culture, moving forward and moving back. And popular music studies, I think, has always been able to recognize these cycles, if you will, the movements between tradition and then kind of intervening into that tradition and changing things, breaking it up, flipping the record, making something new happen. And I think that, well, I'll stop there, but just to recognize that it was a very easy thing to bring those things into conversation. I think it speaks to the openness of the fields. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
I think one of the interesting things, when I think about my involvement in IASPM Canada and just thinking about, sort of disciplinarity generally, and this is constantly reiterated here, is that we're drawn from such a disparate group of disciplines, but somehow managed to find this kind of common area in which to speak. I mean, this is a conversation that we have a lot in communication studies, where I find myself now actually having come from, almost the opposite trajectory, which was a history of very formal music training. And right around that same time, 2000, 2001, where I became aware of, the wider sort of popular music studies community. Again, my interests and my record collection were married, which was my interest in playing popular music and listening to popular music and the possibility of getting it all for free. And this turned into, pretty much my dominant research project through the PhD. But I was just sort of thinking about the connections that you were talking about, and it makes me think that, a lot of the things that we do here are almost like this kind of weird, like insurgent form of guerrilla scholarship or something like that. Every time you come to IASPM, there's somebody talking about this little kind of element that you might say, well, that's a communication studies paper, that's an internet studies paper, or that's a cultural studies thing, but it's actually, hovering in and around, the conversation around popular music. That's probably one of the most fantastic things about this organization, is that for those of us who might be housed in other disciplines or associated with disciplines with their own kind of histories and trajectories, the possibility of bringing new things back to those disciplines. So, okay, there's that, which is kind of the positive end of things. The other end of things, though, is this kind of, I don't know if it's a danger, but it's something that's worth reflecting on when disciplinarity gets kind of so dispersed. And you brought up sort of the funding, new issues around funding and things like that. Is it also, at least in my mind anyways, it tends to make it easier for certain sort of favored elements of that interdisciplinarity to kind of move their way to the top, so to speak, as far as their favor amongst university administrations or funding organizations. There's something, I think, really to be said for wide-ranging big discussions that draw from a variety of disciplines, and maybe one of the dangers of the themed conference, which obviously we've done a good job of kind of getting around, is that it starts to specify the scholarship maybe in a way that's detrimental to what it is that we do, and so that's just one of the things that I tend to think about, because we see this constantly. Obviously certain types of study and certain types of scholarship valued over others, and these days it's whatever their instrumental worth is to the economy, or however you want to put it. There's something to be said for a kind of wide-ranging, almost, pointless form of scholarship, if you want to put it that way, right? Something that isn't actually directed towards addressing a particular issue or a particular theme, but something that's really, in the spirit of kind of just general inquiry. That's one of the things that I think is really great when you actually think about the papers that are given at IASPM Canada conferences. If you look at them in their totality, there's this real kind of, vibrancy and spirit of inquiry. And it's just something to reflect on, I think, and I like to think about it a lot, the sort of pros and cons of this kind of transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity. That's kind of where I'm thinking.
I'm really happy to hear you say that, because that was one of the themes we were talking about in the executive committee meeting last night, as it happens. But anyway, does anyone else want to chime in on this point about Okay, let's end the nostalgia portion of our conversation now and talk a little bit more about, what are our challenges now within this organization and sort of in the scholarly community beyond, and what is our role, IASPM Canada, in the sort of broader scholarly Canadian community in popular culture studies and in music studies and all the other fields that we represent. So, let's maybe go to Lena and Charity to start that off.
Okay, I'll start. I thought it was an important thing to bring up. It's like the organization's doing much better. It's doing great. We're doing great. We're all great. Okay. Once this is said, I think there are things that under the rubric of challenges, I think are worth mentioning. I don't think we could take for granted neither the organization nor the discipline, and I put vertical commas on popular music studies as a discipline, which I'm not sure at all it is. So I'll be blunt. I don't think it's a discipline, to be honest. I think it's a meeting ground for all sorts of inquiries, to use Paul's word. And I don't want to put down the fact that it has a specificity in terms of what it brings together and so on. But what I mean to suggest is that I think one of the challenges is for people who do work on popular music and for the organization to be to look ahead. For me, there's the question of the relevance of what we do is always something of a challenge. I don't mean it in a negative sense. I don't mean, of course, we don't do this and this and that. That's not what I mean. What I mean by relevance is to be able to think about the various ways in which the practices, the products, the institutions, the sounds, the whatever we study, change and connect with each other differently and connect through the world differently. Studying popular music 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and now, for me, means totally different things. One person who, even under torture, I won't mention the name, but said something at some point about how one should outgrow popular music as a field of study. And that made me all very, very angry. Very, very, very angry. But I couldn't put my fingers on how come. Apart from the fact that I thought it was insulting, I think, how? Why think that? And it made me think about this challenge, because it's not so much that one could or could not outgrow or popular music studies, but I think that as a group, we can learn different ways of addressing the connections between why popular music and not something else. Years ago, the obvious thing was that popular music was key for identity for young people. And it became one of the leading, not necessarily what people started studying, but a sort of like basis upon which you could decide that, oh yeah, this is relevant. It's relevant because of that. And that was really one of the key elements. So it was this connection to identity. The 90s were whole identities. So one of the questions for me, one of the challenges is how does one think without necessarily taking for granted the connections and the, I want to say, the effectivity of music and popular music. Take that for granted and just continue doing what we do, which is just look at it and study it from the point of view which has started to be relevant years before. So I'm thinking along those lines in terms of a challenge, because I don't know yet. I don't know, maybe some of you have ideas about that. What is the effectivity of music now? Is it still a question of identity? Is it still a question? I don't know. But I think it's worth asking, because it challenges not only how we define what we do, but it also posits and redefines the kind of questions that, from our different perspectives, can become the meeting grounds upon which we can base the different research that we do. So that's, for me, that's one thing. The second thing is, one of the challenges for the organization is how can we move in a not only academic, but I want to say more broadly defined intellectual world with all the vertical commas, when this world is being under attack. Not only does our conservative government is almost doing it on purpose, research is being really significantly challenged, both as a practice and as an institutional thing, not only in terms of funding, but in terms of orienting the types of questions that are being asked. Who is allowed to ask it? Who are the so-called experts now of course, discursive expertise that has become extremely important. So I think that as an organization, we could pretend we're very happy, and I'm amongst the ones who are very happy that we do get our SSHRC funding. Yes, we struggle, and yes, we get it, and yes, chapeau, les filles. Once again, you managed to do it, so that's great. But once this is said, I think we cannot just surf on that. And I would like the organization in ways, as a challenge, to find ways of not only surviving, but making a point of questioning the basis upon which our own work can and cannot be done, and in connection with how, more broadly, the fields of knowledge, and for me, knowledge is power, so the fields of knowledge power are being challenged. And how can we say something about that? And why could we say something through our quote-unquote expertise on music? And I think that's not just a sort of aside thing. For me, that's a significant challenge. It's not only because it provides the basic conditions under which we could do the work we do, but it's also questioning the very conditions upon which the organization can do something. So for me, those are challenges.
To the barricades.
Yes, I'm trying to how can we meet these challenges? Do what we need to do.
I was asked to challenge.
I know.
Not tell you how.
I'm a problem solver. So.
I know you are.
I think a couple of things. One, I totally agree with everything that you said, except around the disciplinarity of popular music studies.
That's all right.
And I'm very political. I use it in a political way that, yes, I'm a popular music studies scholar, that I work in a discipline of popular music studies. That is where my work is, and that is the only place that I have found, and maybe, I don't know, I've made it up or I've taken it on from my mentors, where I am able to come at popular music and the work that I do through, initially, yes, I have a degree in women's studies, an MA. I have a degree in ethnomusicology/musicology for my PhD. I worked in, and I do cultural studies. I do critical studies. I do queer studies. I do critical technology studies. I've come through it at folklore, indigenous studies. But for me, the discipline of popular music studies is a place where I've been able to draw all of those things together and do what I do. And it's the only way that I feel that I can define what I do, that is the complexities of what many of us do. And so I guess too, I am coming out of a place where popular music was not seen as serious, and certainly not doing work on women musicians or Britney fans or all of these kinds of things, even thinking about child stars and what this great work that we heard yesterday, where is the place for that? Well, the place for that is in the discipline of popular music studies, in my vision, and so I see it as a ground, and I see it as a place to be an activist in that kind of way, within the institutional settings, which challenge us in a variety of different ways. The problem around SSHRC funding, yes, we've been very successful over the last few years. St. John's, Regina twice, Montreal, Hamilton, thanks to Susan and Christina for such amazing work. Getting those SSHRC grants they're a struggle, and they make you frustrated. And of course, we know just even doing a SSHRC CV, the new SSHRC CV is just, can I poke my eyes out? I don't understand who thought of these things and how they can't get it right. It's, but at the same time, that work falls on few people. It's a great deal of work, and yet it's a privilege because it has allowed us to grow. It has allowed us to support graduate students to come. It has allowed us to maintain and do the things that we do, in the sense that it's allowed us to go to Regina and have successful conferences that far west. Because it's not on the, it's not cheap to get to Regina. It's not cheap to get to St. John's or Halifax. It's not cheap to get to Nova Scotia. That was another conference that was successful with the SSHRC. No, it wasn't. It was a try.
We bombed twice.
Oh, the East Coast, we got to do something there. No, but to say, the other thing that happens with SSHRC is, yes, you have to shape yourself in particular kinds of ways. I think that the theme of this conference, music and labor, and being in Hamilton, and I think it's exciting, and there's a lot of really great work here that in the program we're going to see a lot, and we have so far, but we will continue to see a lot of really interesting work that maybe wouldn't have or hadn't found a place. So, the themes of the conference, I think it's important for us to also be able to think about our work in thematic ways that maybe we wouldn't have been comfortable thinking about or even have thought to go there. I've never really thought about my work in terms of labor. I had to, and it made me think about technologies and mobile platforms, et cetera, in different kinds of ways, and how, Indigenous artists are challenging and trying to create and draw on these kinds of platforms to understand labor practices. So I do think there's a place for that. I think it's hard. We continue, because of the climate, we continue to shape ourselves and try and fit into these really strange molds. I mean, I'm no longer sort of going after SSHRC money, but I'm now at CIHR, so all of a sudden my research has all become about health and communities, which, yes, I can do that, but sometimes you just want to be able to do what you do, right, without thinking about those things. But you are forced to, and you have responsibilities to the universities and the institutions, and responsibilities to your students to be able to fund them. So we jump through the hoops. So anyway, I'm just going to say the challenge of that, I think one of the things I would really like us to see is IASPM to somehow sustain, and maybe not through SSHRC or whatever it is, but I worry that if we walk if we struggle, or if we are unable to find a way to do it where there's a team, where people can be supported through those kinds of processes, then when we move, especially out of the center spot of Ontario, that we will not have as rich conversations because we won't have as many junior scholars there, as young people. So that's something that I worry about as an ongoing concern. And one of the challenges I think that we need to address as we go forward.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it seems right from just these two discussions so far, right? We're kind of like caught in this dance between sort of being and doing, right? What is it, but also what does it do in the world? And there is this kind of, at least listening to Lean and Charity, I'm thinking, there's obviously an anxiety, and maybe this is not probably restricted to IASPM, but it's, to research and inquiry in general, an anxiety around, whether or not we're actually going to be able to do what we want to do, under threat, basically, under duress. And this is an important discussion to have, because and I tend to think of it much more on the doing side. That is not to say like instrumentalizing the scholarship or something like that, but really sort of thinking deeply about what it is that the types of work that we all do, what type of kind of effects those have, like in the broader scholarly community, with relationship to things like funding agencies, with relationship to the seeming need to elevate ideology over evidence that seems to kind of surround us right now. And I'm glad that you didn't answer those questions with a proscriptive plan, because this is where you get into, again, this other thing that seems to be coming out in these discussions, which is the relative autonomy that we have when we think in terms of our discipline as transdisciplinary. We don't have a set of methodologies that make us popular music scholars, or a set of topics that we address. There's a kind of autonomy of action and autonomy of research that we're privileged enough to have, which kind of butts up against the need for some kind of organization that reflects that without turning it into a kind of hierarchy or prescription around the discipline. This is a discussion that a few of us got into last night, Owen and myself and Eric and a couple of others, just around how that's going to be integrated, say, into the use of the web or through social media, how we actually can develop an organization that reflects both the diversity and the autonomy that makes the organization what it is, right? So now, we can't just sort of sit in this place where we say, okay, well, we have an executive and who all do a great job, obviously, who tell us then, these are the directions that we're going to have. One of the things that and so that's just kind of like the wider point, and we can reflect on that all we like, and we do constantly, regardless of discipline. But one of the things that I found really interesting in my first IASPM Canada experience, which actually took place in the States, which is when the resolution was passed during the AGM to condemn the use of music in any form of torture or interrogation, right? That to me was a real eye-opener, because I don't know if that did anything for anybody, but it certainly did something for me, and I think that everybody in the room who read the paper, was it Susan Cusick who wrote the paper, it certainly had a profound impact on the way that I thought about music and what people were, the uses of music in the world. So whether or not that had any effect on, enhanced interrogation techniques or whatever is beside the point. It had an impact on the scholars. It had an impact on research. Just the putting the foot forward and saying, okay, this is something that as an organization, or at least those people who were present at the general meeting who raised their hands in support, are comfortable saying and representing our collective kind of ideas. And in fact, there was dissent, and we scrutinized the language, I think, a little bit in that meeting as well. Okay, how do we actually want to say this? And the only reason I bring this up is because, it's my own failing as much as anybody else's, but, over the last 5 years, there's been plenty of opportunity for the organization to intervene. So any discussions over, C32, C11, all of the changes in funding structures for Ontario popular music, which we learned about from Richard yesterday, there's a lot of opportunities to say something about this. Now, whether or not we say that this is the collective view of everybody in IASPM Canada, or whether it's co-authored and everybody signs names or things like that. I'm not saying we have to do it or we should do it. I'm just saying that to me was a really powerful thing that a scholarly organization or any organization can do. And not because we're all going to go away disappointed when a state authority decides, oh, we're going to pass this bill anyways, and we're going to say, oh, it's useless, it's pointless to do this, but because it's the right thing to do, more than anything, right? And it can have a lot of impact. Like going back to my own experience with the music and torture statement. So there's the possibility of doing that. I mean, especially around issues of copyright, intellectual property, broadcast policy, and things like that. Like those things fundamentally can alter, even like just from my own personal research, which was into music piracy. If any of these bills had actually been passed in their original forms, written by the Conservative government, I literally I very much could have been arrested for doing my research. I could not have actually done the research in any way where I could have any protection, which kind of made it exciting, but at the same time, it was also not very. I didn't, relish the idea of going to jail for wanting to listen to popular music. But those are the stakes. Like if you want to play YouTube videos in your presentations, or quickly grab an MP3 online to use in class, and you don't happen to have the record, those things are actually at stake, and they could undermine the entire operation of doing any kind of popular music studies. These are the types of things that we could write on. Now, I'll just say I was doing the PhD for the last 5 years, and that's why I didn't write something and circulate it to you all on the listserv. But, maybe it's something that we can think about as one way of just kind of addressing what does IASPM do in the world. Are these ideas of statements or some kind of intervention into the things that matter to our discipline? So.
Maybe opening up to everybody.
I didn't say before, and of course I could go on, but you've done great, so let's open it
We're all
up.
big talkers, right? But I think at this point it would be great to talk to all of you and to get you guys in the conversation too about what exactly do we do? What can we do? Are there causes that we couldn't get behind? Is it, is that a productive kind of work that we can do? What is kind of our purpose? I think just thinking about some of the comments that have been made, I'm gonna actually line up with Lean and think that popular music studies is a field, not a discipline. I think, and in fact, I think that therein lies our strength, that we don't have a shared method, a common methodology or canon of scholarship that we all use. I mean, I'm a trained musicologist. I care about pitches and instrumentation and song structures and notes in ways that I think other scholars don't as much, and I think that's part of the way we inform each other. We don't even have a common citation style that we all use as popular music scholars, and I think that's really what I think we need to kind of defend that to the hilt, that we are a multidisciplinary field, that we all have bring our own disciplinary expertises to popular music studies and learn from one another. And it's certainly, I think it makes me a better scholar that I am forced to read stuff that uses that awful MLA citation style. What is wrong with you people? And it enriches my work and certainly my teaching and the way I think and the way I am. And so I think those things are tremendously valuable and important, and I want to defend them. And I'm also I'm passionate about popular music matters. Music matters. People care about it. It has an important role in our society, and it is our job as experts in this field. We need to advocate for how that works in society. We need to stand up and be counted on these issues, and I would love to hear from you about your thoughts on these issues. So does anyone want to chime in? And I'm going to call names. Yes, Heather.
I feel weird speaking here because I feel like I need to speak here.
Turn it around.
Maybe I'll just turn this sides to get my better side that way. I wanted to speak about a couple of issues that for me stood out as I was thinking about IASPM. One is for me as an ethnomusicologist who's been coming off and on to IASPM for a long time. And my research originally was in Gaelic song in Cape Breton and the intersections between folk and traditional music and then popular music. And I would like to encourage this society to make more space for those kinds of intersections. So what I see, and quite understandably so, is that IASPM tends to focus on sort of mainstream Anglo-American popular musics. And I see more of this sort of tradition-based popular musics, I guess, coming into the conferences. And I see more interest in other music industries and music scenes outside of North America and Britain. So I see, for example, yesterday we had papers on Latin America and Caribbean. I see there's going to be papers on Japanese music scenes. So that's great. I think I would encourage that to grow. This comes from my own personal experience presenting one time on Gaelic pop on a panel that also had Chris talking about Rush cover albums, and somebody else had been talking about Kiss albums. And nobody could come up with a question for me because I just think it was just too weird, right? Everybody's like, yeah, Rush, Kiss, right? They had lots of questions. But the idea of sort of Gaelic traditional music and pop music overlapping was very weird for a lot of people, I think. So I would encourage that interdisciplinarity more. I think that's maybe a place that could still grow. The second thing I would suggest is thinking a lot about where is academia going and thinking about Lean's really quite thoughtful comments. There are fewer and fewer jobs out there for our graduate students, and the jobs that exist are crappier. So they have less and less stability. There's more and more part-time work, less tenure-track jobs. And I think we have a responsibility to think about what kinds of programs are we running, who are they for, and where are those students going afterwards. And we need to think about preparing our students not just in mentorship for an academic job, such as we might have, but to think about what kinds of other jobs could our students be going into, what kinds of training can we provide them. And a society like this and a meeting like this is a great place to think about what options there are and to think about what kinds of training we can provide opportunities for our students. So those are my two thoughts for the society.
I guess I'm the caller upper. Who's Christina, please come on up. Yeah, exactly.
Hello. So thank you, first of all, to the panel for raising some really thoughtful, interesting things. I would love to have the discussion about, the disciplinarity and the scope of the conference. I think that Lean's observations about the way the society has changed, very useful. I want to sort of piggyback on your point, Heather, about the ways that academia is changing. And perhaps it's also just coming off of the grant and the conference organizing that I'm particularly thinking about these issues in terms of about the future of the organization and sustainability, which I think is challenging not just because of the ways that grad students are moving into academic jobs and the sorts of jobs they're moving into. And I think it also depends upon the model that we have, that SSHRC seems to expect that we have senior scholars, large research universities to run these SSHRC-funded conferences. And of course, I think that's an interesting discussion that we'll be having at the AGM. But also, what does service look like when you have smaller numbers of tenured professors or tenure track professors who are traditionally expected to carry the load of running organizations like this? Mm-hmm. And I think what we begin to see is, the thinking about the ethics of work for all of us, for those of us who are grad students, for those of us who are working part-time or very contingent sort of jobs, for those of us who are, I think one of the things that I'm seeing at my university is that as our departments shrink, as we take on more students, I think many associate and full professors have seen their workloads grow tremendously. And I think that when I think about what balls get dropped when you are in that position, and I think that one of the balls that potentially gets dropped is your service to national and international societies. And maybe I'm only operating with my lens of, I'm about 10 years into my career as a professor. I've been in grad school was in grad school in the mid-1990s, and so perhaps maybe I'm forgetting what the 70s or the 80s were like. I was 11 in 1983, so perhaps I'm sort of operating in the short memory of crisis. But I do see that thinking about how this is going to play out and how this organization works and how we devote our energy to it. I'm sorry that I'm not coming with the amazing solution, but I think that thinking about how these conferences come together, the value of funding grad students and travel for grad students, but also the ways that is carried on different people in the organization, I think that is something that is worth thinking about. And that what we're seeing here is not just an issue for our organization or our organization in relation to other organizations, but in the ways that our field of work is changing and the ways that institutions are changing and the ways that grad students are seen as revenue generators by many of our institutions. And the very interesting ethical questions that Heather raised, and I think many of us think about a great deal about what happens when those wonderful revenue generators then have to have jobs, and suddenly our universities are not willing to invest in all of those revenue generators, which is I think a troubling way. And I think that as a society, that is something that I hope we think about as well. So leave it there.
Okay. I see we are actually running up against time, and I think all of us probably deserve a coffee break at this point, unless there are any other burning questions that we want to, anyone's champing at the bit. Okay, it looks like you're not. Excellent. Okay, I think this has been an excellent foundation. I'm so grateful to all of you and to Christina and Susan for organizing this. I think this gives us a great foundation for our discussion at the annual general meeting. Certainly it's given me a lot to think about, and I hope we'll sort of build on the things that we've learned about here. I care greatly about this organization. Obviously all of us do, and I think that that sort of commitment really will lend itself to a greater vibrancy and growth and change in the years to come. So please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their ideas and thoughts.